It all started with something as trivial as a single flower bed. Or, at least, that's how it seemed at first. To anyone else, a few brightly colored daisies in the front yard would hardly be an issue. But for Jessica Palmer, the fight began over something far more sinister than a harmless garden. It began with her homeowners association, or as she'd soon start calling it, her nemesis. Jessica had lived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Pinewood Acres for nearly 7 years. Nestled between tall oaks and a carefully manicured street of homes that seemed more like a stage set than real life, her home stood proudly at the corner of Elm and Maple. It was a modest two-story with a white picket fence and a small but well-kept lawn. Jessica, a professional graphic designer, was meticulous about her home, perhaps a little too meticulous, or so the HOA seemed to think. To her, it was the perfect place to settle down. To the HOA, however, it was a constant battleground. The first violation came about 2 months after she moved in. She'd painted her front door a soft shade of teal, a color she thought was warm and inviting. That's when the HOA sent their first letter, an official warning that the color violated their strict uniformity standards. Jessica was taken aback at first, but when she called the HOA office, she was told that all front doors in the neighborhood needed to be either white, gray, or navy blue. Teal was a no-go. Thinking it was a simple misunderstanding, she painted the door a dull shade of navy and moved on with her life. But that was just the beginning. The fines started rolling in. It wasn't just the front door anymore. The HOA seemed to find fault with everything she did, no matter how insignificant. A broken mailbox? Fine. A garden gnome that was a little too large for their liking? Fine. A flag hanging on the porch for the 4th of July? Fine. It felt as though she was constantly at war with an invisible force that was now setting its sights on her beloved flower bed. It was a Saturday when Jessica received the infamous letter that would forever change her relationship with the HOA. She was sipping coffee in her kitchen when the letter slid through the mail slot, as if it had been waiting for just the right moment. Her eyes skimmed over the first few lines, which stated, "This is a final warning about the violation concerning your front yard flower arrangement." Her heart sank. The letter went on to describe how the placement of the flower bed violated the HOA's aesthetic guidelines, specifically citing that the excessive use of color and plant types was a breach of community harmony. Jessica couldn't believe what she was reading. She had a few tulips, some marigolds, and a couple of pansies, nothing that screamed chaos. But apparently, to the HOA, her little garden was an act of rebellion. She tried to reason with them, calling the HOA office and speaking to the same woman who had dealt with her in the past. "Ma'am, the rules are clear," she said in that monotonous, robotic voice that seemed to echo all the frustrations Jessica had come to associate with the HOA. "You violated the natural aesthetic clause, and this is your third warning. If the flower bed is not removed by the end of the week, you will face a fine of $500. The threat of a fine didn't scare Jessica. What angered her was the principle. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about a faceless, overreaching institution that was trying to control every aspect of her life, and she was done being pushed around. But she knew what would happen next. The HOA wasn't just going to let her walk away. She'd already been given multiple warnings, and they'd been clear about their stance on fines. They'd already drained her with ridiculous demands, and this flower bed was just their latest excuse to flex their power. Jessica wasn't about to let them win. She had a plan. After hanging up the phone with the HOA rep, she sat down at her desk and began researching. What were her rights? What could she do? The more she dug, the more she realized just how much the HOA had overstepped its boundaries. She found stories from other homeowners who had been bullied, harassed, and fined over trivial matters. Some had even been forced to move. That was it. She wasn't going to let this bureaucracy push her around any longer. The next few days were a whirlwind. She started gathering information, checking the local government's regulations on HOAs, reading legal precedents, and even consulting with a lawyer. Her lawyer confirmed what she had suspected. The HOA was skating on thin ice. They had overstepped the boundaries of their authority, and Jessica had the power to fight back. More than that, she had the right to refuse their fines and take them to court. The idea of going to court felt overwhelming at first. Jessica had never been involved in a legal battle before, but something about the idea of standing up for her rights gave her the strength she needed. If she could win, it wouldn't just be a victory for her. It would send a message to the HOA and anyone else who thought they could bully homeowners into submission. And so, with a determined heart and a stack of legal documents in hand, Jessica made the bold decision. She was going to court. But she didn't know just how far the HOA would go to protect their interests, or how much they would try to make her life a living nightmare in the process. Jessica had made up her mind, but what she hadn't fully realized yet was the sheer power and persistence of the HOA. They were more than just a governing body. They were a machine, efficient, relentless, and armed with an army of lawyers. It wasn't just a matter of her being right. This would be a battle against an institution that was used to getting its way, and they weren't about to let her get away with defying them. It didn't take long for Jessica to feel the weight of what she had decided to do. It was one thing to read about other homeowners who had successfully taken on their HOA, but it was an entirely different beast when you were the one being targeted. As soon as she filed her intention to dispute the fines in court, the HOA kicked into high gear, and it quickly became clear they were going to make this as difficult as possible. The first sign of retaliation came just days after Jessica's filing. She came home from work to find an official notice taped to her front door. The letter was from the HOA's legal team, and it didn't mince words. Your violation of the aesthetic guidelines regarding your front yard has escalated to the level of legal action. Due to your refusal to comply, we have increased the fine to $1,500. If this amount is not paid within 10 days, additional fees and potential legal consequences will follow. It was a stark warning, one designed to intimidate. The HOA was trying to hit her where it hurt, knowing full well that a fine this large could be financially devastating. But Jessica didn't flinch. She tore the letter from the door and marched into her home, more determined than ever. They wanted a fight? She would give them one. But things quickly escalated. Just a few days later, Jessica noticed something peculiar. There were strange cars circling her neighborhood, all parked just a little too long on her street. At first, she thought nothing of it. Perhaps some new neighbors were moving in. But then she saw it. A man in a suit, clipboard in hand, walking slowly past her house. His eyes darted to her front yard. He paused at her flower bed, scribbling something on his clipboard. The chill that ran down her spine was instant. "Is he from the HOA?" she muttered to herself. Before she could even react, the man walked back to his car and drove off. She hurried outside to inspect her garden, only to find her flowers trampled. The vibrant tulips she had planted just weeks ago were crushed into the muddy soil. She stood there, staring in disbelief. Was this a coincidence? Or was it retaliation? It was impossible not to connect the dots. The HOA was sending a message, a brutal, physical one. They were no longer just hitting her with fines. They were making her life miserable, trying to intimidate her into submission. Jessica knew she had to take action. She took photos of the damage and filed a report with the police, though she knew the chances of getting any sort of justice for a trampled flower bed were slim. Still, she wasn't going to let the HOA bully her. But the retaliation didn't stop there. The next few weeks were a blur of increasing tension. The HOA began to send more frequent letters, not just about her flower bed, but about everything they could possibly find. Her mailbox was a violation of the neighborhood's standards. The shade of green she'd chosen for her lawn was too bright. Even her driveway, perfectly smooth and well-kept, was labeled a non-compliant surface because, apparently, it wasn't the exact color of every other driveway on the block. It was clear. The HOA wasn't just interested in enforcing their rules. They were out to break her spirit. Jessica spent hours on the phone with her lawyer, strategizing and compiling evidence. Her lawyer told her that this kind of harassment was exactly what the courts would take issue with. But the lawyer also warned her that it wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to win. Despite the mounting pressure, Jessica refused to back down. The tipping point came when she received a final, chilling letter from the HOA's attorney. This one was different from the others. Instead of a standard fine or warning, it was a personal attack. The letter accused Jessica of deliberately attempting to disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood and warned her that continued defiance could lead to civil action that would result in even harsher penalties. The idea of civil action was terrifying. Jessica knew what that meant. The HOA was threatening to sue her, to take everything she had, all for something as small as a flower bed and a few minor violations. But even this attempt to rattle her didn't work. In fact, it only fueled her resolve. She was tired of being the victim. The intimidation tactics were nothing more than the HOA's desperate attempt to make her quit, to bend her to their will. But she wasn't going to back down. And so, as the days passed, Jessica began preparing herself for what would be the fight of her life. She gathered all the evidence she could: photographs, recorded conversations, legal advice, and statements from other neighbors who had faced similar abuses from the HOA. She was going to take them to court. What she didn't know yet was just how far the HOA would go to try to stop her. The day Jessica had been dreading, yet, in some strange way, looking forward to, finally arrived. She sat in the waiting room of the courthouse, her heart racing. The air was thick with anticipation, and the sounds of distant footsteps echoed through the halls as other cases were called. It was just another day for most of the people here. But for Jessica, this was a moment she had spent months preparing for. It was her day to stand up not just for herself, but for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an HOA. She wasn't alone in this fight. With her lawyer by her side and a handful of neighbors who had agreed to testify on her behalf, Jessica felt a sense of solidarity. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was becoming a movement. The people who had suffered at the hands of the HOA were starting to speak up, and they had finally found someone willing to lead the charge. Jessica's mind drifted to the events that had brought her here. The countless fines, the intimidation, the trampled flowers. She had documented every moment of it. But it wasn't just about the petty violations anymore. This was about holding the HOA accountable for its actions. This was about proving that they couldn't just steamroll over people without consequence. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. The courtroom was surprisingly small, and the tension in the air was palpable. As Jessica and her lawyer entered, the opposing side was already there, the HOA's legal team. They were a polished, professional group, wearing suits that seemed a little too perfect, their expressions cold and calculating. The lead attorney, a tall man with silver hair and a permanent scowl, gave Jessica a curt nod as she walked in. She knew this man. He was the one who had sent the threatening letters, the one who had tried to break her down with intimidation. But now, here in this courtroom, he wouldn't be able to hide behind his letters. She would make sure of that. The judge entered and called the session to order. Everyone stood, the sound of shoes clicking on the floor echoing in the room. As they sat, Jessica could feel her nerves start to settle. This was it. The time for playing small was over. It was time to fight back. The HOA's lawyer began first. He laid out their case with a practiced ease, citing their community's aesthetic guidelines and presenting documents that seemed to back up their claims. He talked about how Jessica's flower bed had disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood, how her mailbox and driveway violated approved architectural standards. It sounded ridiculous to Jessica, but she knew that this was how the HOA worked, by throwing a mountain of paperwork at people to make them feel overwhelmed. Jessica's lawyer, a woman named Samantha, was calm and methodical. She countered the HOA's claims with ease, dismantling their arguments point by point. Samantha pointed out that many of the violations the HOA had cited were arbitrary, made up, and inconsistent with their past rulings. She argued that the HOA had selectively enforced its rules, picking and choosing which homeowners to target while letting others go unchecked. Jessica had already proven this through the testimonies of her neighbors, who had been subjected to similar harassment by the HOA. But Jessica's biggest ace in the hole was the harassment angle. Samantha pointed out that the HOA's actions weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about bullying, intimidation, and making Jessica's life miserable. The trampled flower bed was the clearest example, but there were countless other incidents that proved this wasn't just a dispute over a flower bed. It was a concerted effort by the HOA to break her spirit. Jessica watched as the judge listened intently. His face remained neutral, but she could tell he was weighing the evidence carefully. The HOA's lawyer tried to shift the focus back to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, but Samantha cut him off, stating that the HOA's behavior was far beyond reasonable enforcement. They were, in fact, abusing their power. The judge took notes, nodding occasionally, and Jessica felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. Then it was Jessica's turn. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she was ready. She had been practicing her statement for days, running through it over and over again in her head. She had the facts, the evidence, and the moral high ground. Now, she just had to speak the truth. She stood and faced the court. For a moment, she was speechless. She hadn't expected to be so emotional, but the weight of everything that had happened came crashing down on her in that instant. She took a deep breath, then began. "Your Honor," she started, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about a garden or a mailbox. This is about being forced to live in a place where you can't express yourself, where you're punished for doing something as simple as planting flowers in your yard. I've been harassed, threatened, and fined for things that don't even make sense. And when I tried to stand up for myself, the HOA didn't just ignore me. They tried to break me." She paused, letting the words sink in. The HOA doesn't just enforce rules, they bully people. They use their power to control us, to silence us. They don't care about community harmony. They care about control. And I'm not the only one who's suffered. There are others in this neighborhood who are too afraid to speak up. But I'm here today to make sure this ends, not just for me, but for everyone who's been victimized by an HOA that thinks it can do whatever it wants. As she finished speaking, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The hardest part was done. Now, it was in the judge's hands. The HOA's lawyer shot her a withering look, clearly frustrated by her testimony. He tried to get the judge to refocus on the technicalities, but the judge interrupted him, asking for a brief recess. As the courtroom cleared for a break, Jessica's lawyer turned to her, giving her a reassuring smile. "You did great," she said. "Now we wait." But as the minutes ticked by, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The HOA had already shown how far they were willing to go to stop her. What would they do next? How far would they push before they gave up? She had no idea. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. The courtroom battle had left Jessica mentally drained, but something had shifted. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like she was no longer the one being hunted. The HOA's veneer of authority had cracked, if only slightly. And now, with the judge reviewing both sides' evidence and testimonies, Jessica had a rare moment to breathe. But it wasn't peace, it was just a pause. Jessica returned home that evening to a quiet neighborhood, but the silence was deceptive. She had a strange feeling in her gut that things were about to escalate again. She was right. The next morning, she woke up to find her trash bins dumped across her driveway. Every bag was slashed open, its contents scattered like someone had gone through them. Whether it was just vandalism or something more calculated, Jessica didn't care. She knew exactly who was behind it. This wasn't a random act. It was psychological warfare. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but the timing was too perfect. The day after her court appearance, it was a message. The HOA wasn't just reacting anymore. They were retaliating. But instead of letting it rattle her, Jessica took photos, called the police, and filed a report, again. This time, though, she had something new, a suspicion that the HOA's dirty tactics went deeper than anyone knew, that their authority wasn't just overbearing, but potentially corrupt. That night, Jessica began digging. She went through public records, tax filings, HOA board meeting minutes, anything she could get her hands on. What she found was shocking. For years, the Pinewood Acres HOA had been quietly hiking fees, issuing dubious fines, and spending money with almost no transparency. Annual dues had nearly doubled over the last decade, but maintenance services and neighborhood improvements were practically non-existent. Where was the money going? Then she found it. A pattern in the financial reports. Multiple invoices paid to a landscaping company, Greenhaven Property Services, that had billed the HOA for monthly maintenance. But no one in the neighborhood could remember ever seeing Greenhaven trucks. No lawn crews, no hedge trimmers, nothing. Jessica kept digging and discovered that Greenhaven wasn't even a legitimate company. It was registered to a shell address in another county and had one listed officer, Gregory Mills. That name struck a chord. She remembered it from the HOA's board member roster. Gregory Mills was the HOA president. It all clicked. Jessica realized she wasn't just dealing with an overzealous group of neighborhood busybodies. She was dealing with a board president who was embezzling money through a fake company and using the HOA as his personal piggy bank. The fines, the intimidation, the lawsuits, it was all part of a larger scheme to keep homeowners distracted and afraid while he siphoned off funds in plain sight. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. No wonder the HOA had escalated so quickly when she refused to comply. She wasn't just breaking aesthetic rules. She was threatening their power structure, their scam. Jessica gathered everything. Copies of the financial reports, public business records, timestamps, board meeting minutes, and all the emails and letters she had received. She compiled it into a massive file and handed it over to her lawyer. When Samantha reviewed the evidence, she was stunned. "This isn't just a civil case anymore," she said. "This could lead to a full criminal investigation." The strategy changed overnight. No longer was it about defending against a petty violation. It was about exposing corruption. Samantha reached out to a local investigative journalist she had connections with, someone who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Within days, a story was in development. Jessica gave her statement anonymously at first, worried about backlash. But she knew the truth needed to come out. Meanwhile, she and Samantha filed a formal motion to request a financial audit of the HOA's records. The court granted a temporary injunction, preventing the HOA from collecting any additional fines from Jessica or anyone else until the matter was resolved. Word spread fast in the neighborhood. Homeowners who had previously stayed silent started coming forward with their own stories. Fines for phantom violations, unapproved charges, threats of liens for late payments that were never actually late. Jessica's story had ignited something. One elderly couple revealed they had paid nearly $4,000 in bogus fines over the last 2 years for excessive watering, despite their lawn being completely dry and dead. Another neighbor shared how the HOA had denied his request for a wheelchair ramp, calling it a disruption to neighborhood appearance. People were fed up. But as the community rallied, the HOA grew more desperate. Late one night, Jessica heard a noise outside. She looked out her window and saw flashlights moving near her garage. She immediately called the police, who arrived just minutes later. The intruders were gone, but her side gate had been broken. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. Jessica doubled down. She installed security cameras around her house, shared footage of suspicious activity with her lawyer, and handed everything over to the local police department. Samantha also contacted the county's HOA regulatory board, demanding an investigation into the financial mismanagement. And as the local news team began preparing their segment, the heat was rising quickly. Then came the real blow to the HOA. A whistleblower. An anonymous letter arrived at Jessica's attorney's office. It was from someone claiming to be on the HOA board. The letter detailed how Gregory Mills had manipulated elections, silenced dissenting board members, and forced through policies that gave him unchecked control. It even included screenshots of internal emails between Mills and the fake landscaping company's email address, emails that discussed clearing out troublemakers and burying them in fines. It was the smoking gun. With the whistleblower's letter, the court now had more than just a civil dispute. It had evidence of fraud, harassment, and criminal misconduct. Jessica knew the tide had officially turned. But as the next court date loomed, she couldn't help but wonder what Gregory Mills would do now that his empire was beginning to crumble. Cracks in the foundation, the courtroom was different this time. The atmosphere no longer held the same suffocating pressure Jessica had felt before. This time, the weight had shifted, and not in the HOA's favor. As Jessica entered with her lawyer Samantha, they were greeted by several familiar faces. Neighbors who had quietly supported her now stood tall in the gallery. There was a ripple of energy in the air, a sense that something big was about to break. Everyone could feel it. Across the aisle sat Gregory Mills, the once confident president of the HOA. But today he looked nervous. His usual smug posture was gone. He barely made eye contact, his expression twitchy and uncertain. His legal team was thinner than before, and one of his co-counsels wasn't present at all. Word had gotten around. The house of cards was beginning to fall. Jessica had handed over every shred of evidence she and her lawyer had collected: financial discrepancies, forged invoices, intimidation tactics, even the anonymous whistleblower letter. The judge had taken it all seriously. This wasn't a petty HOA case anymore. This was fraud, potential embezzlement, abuse of power. And today, the court had reconvened to hear a motion that could shake the foundation of Pinewood Acres: a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances and a motion to remove Gregory Mills and any complicit board members from their positions. As the hearing began, Samantha delivered a laser-sharp argument, laying out the case with clinical precision. She explained how Greenhaven Property Services, registered to Gregory Mills, was billing the HOA tens of thousands of dollars annually for landscaping services that were never rendered. She showed how the HOA's enforcement of violations wasn't just inconsistent, but deliberately targeted, especially toward residents who spoke out or questioned leadership. The judge listened without interruption. Then came the bombshell. Samantha presented the whistleblower letter. With court approval, she read it aloud, naming names, describing rigged board elections, internal threats, and the manipulation of HOA rules to keep dissenting voices off the board. It detailed how Gregory had pocketed community funds for years while presenting fake balance sheets to residents during the annual meetings. There was a pause, then a murmur. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Even the judge raised his eyebrows at the letter's accusations. Gregory's lawyer stood up and objected. Hearsay, he argued, anonymous and unverifiable. But Samantha countered quickly, revealing that a second letter had since arrived, this time with a name. The whistleblower had come forward. Her name was Ellen Vasquez, a former treasurer of the HOA board who had quietly resigned 2 years ago. Ellen had submitted a sworn affidavit, providing her knowledge of the shady accounting practices and confirming that Gregory had instructed her to round up figures and not worry about the paper trail. She refused, and shortly after, she was pressured to step down under the guise of a conflict of interest. It was no longer just Jessica's word against the HOA. It was multiple witnesses, documents, fraudulent payments, all of it, now laid bare in a courtroom. Gregory Mills' face was drained of color. The judge paused proceedings and called for a recess to review the evidence. The room slowly cleared, and Jessica sat down in a quiet hallway outside the courtroom, her thoughts racing. She had never imagined it would go this far. What started with a flower bed had unraveled a web of corruption and deceit that had likely affected hundreds of homeowners over the years. Samantha joined her, leaning against the wall. "He's finished," she said calmly. The court can now force a forensic audit, and if the fraud is confirmed, which it will be, the HOA board can be dissolved or restructured under court supervision. He could also face criminal charges. Jessica nodded, trying to process it all. I didn't set out to destroy the HOA, she said. I just wanted to be left alone, to have my garden, to not be fined into silence. Samantha smiled faintly. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The second half of the hearing moved faster than expected. The judge ordered the financial audit and placed a temporary freeze on all HOA accounts. Gregory was suspended from his duties effective immediately. A neutral financial trustee would now oversee the HOA's operations until the audit was complete. The court also granted a protective order for any residents who had submitted testimony, ensuring that no retaliation could take place. Jessica's fine was dismissed in full, but even more than the personal victory, it was what came next that marked a turning point. In the days following the ruling, local media picked up the story. The headline: Homeowner exposes HOA corruption in explosive court case. Reporters swarmed Pinewood Acres. Residents were interviewed. Jessica was approached for a sit-down segment. The footage of her front yard, her crushed flowers, and the stack of violation letters told the story in a way no legal brief ever could. Then came the community meeting. For the first time in years, it wasn't held under the strict control of the board. Instead, it was led by residents. Jessica spoke first, sharing her story publicly for the first time, in her own words. The room gave her a standing ovation. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. People who had once kept their heads down were now raising their voices. Elderly residents who had lived in fear of fines. Single parents who were hit with petty violations for letting their kids leave a bike on the lawn. Veterans, retirees, young couples. All of them had stories. And now, they had a voice. That night, they voted to create a new temporary committee, an oversight group of residents who would work with the court-appointed trustee to rebuild the HOA from the ground up. Fair rules, clear enforcement, full transparency. Jessica was nominated as chair. She never wanted power, but after everything she'd endured, she understood it better than anyone. Not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. But just as Pinewood Acres began to heal, another ripple appeared on the horizon. Whispers of similar stories from other nearby neighborhoods. Other HOAs. Other homeowners facing intimidation, excessive fines, and silence. Jessica had uncovered one scandal. But how many more were still buried? Was this just the end of her personal battle, or the beginning of something far bigger? Jessica never intended to become a symbol. She never planned to challenge an institution or expose corruption. All she wanted was to live in peace, tend her garden, and be left alone. But somewhere between that first fine for her teal front door and the court's ruling to remove the HOA president, she had become something more, a catalyst. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, Pinewood Acres transformed. The suffocating tension that had once blanketed the neighborhood began to lift. People who had avoided each other out of fear of being reported were now talking, on sidewalks, in driveways, at front porches. Small acts of rebellion had become symbols of unity. Lawn chairs returned to front yards. Flags fluttered from porches. Flower beds bloomed without fear. And for the first time in years, people smiled at each other without looking over their shoulders. Jessica was at the center of it all, but she didn't see herself as a hero. If anything, she felt like a survivor, someone who had been dragged through a storm and made it out intact. But even as the winds died down in her own community, she knew others were still weathering the same storm. Emails started pouring in. It began with one or two, people who had seen the local news story and wanted advice. Then dozens more. Homeowners from across the state, and then across the country, reached out. Some sent detailed accounts of similar abuse from their own HOAs. Others simply wrote to thank her for standing up when they couldn't. Jessica was overwhelmed, but something inside her stirred. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a system designed to silence, to control, to profit from fear. She had uncovered one corrupt HOA, but there were thousands more operating in the shadows. That's when the journalist who had covered her story reached out again. The station had been flooded with responses after airing this segment. People wanted more. They wanted to understand their rights, their legal options, their power. So, Jessica agreed to do something she'd never considered before. She went public. In an exclusive follow-up interview, she told the full story, start to finish. The fines, the retaliation, the court battle, the financial fraud. She didn't hold back. She named names. She showed evidence. And, for the first time, she called for national reform of HOA laws. The video went viral. What began as a local HOA dispute turned into a nationwide conversation. The YouTube clip of her interview racked up millions of views. Other channels picked up the story, offering commentary, analysis, and personal testimonies from their own audiences. Hashtags trended. Forums lit up. Jessica Palmer had unintentionally become the face of a grassroots movement, and she embraced it. With the help of her lawyer, Samantha, and a few trusted allies from her neighborhood, Jessica launched an online platform, HOA Freedom.org, a nonprofit hub where homeowners could access legal resources, share their stories, and organize local reform efforts. The site offered guides on how to challenge illegal fines, demand transparency, and run for their own HOA boards to take back control from within. Within the first week, the site had over 50,000 unique visitors. But with visibility came pressure. Jessica began receiving anonymous threats. Some emails were filled with vague warnings to watch her step. Others accused her of trying to destroy community values. It didn't scare her anymore, not after what she had been through. But it reminded her that not everyone welcomed change. Still, she pushed forward. She started speaking at town halls and homeowners meetings in nearby communities. Some were welcoming, others were hostile. She stood in church basements and school gymnasiums, sharing her story and answering questions from people who felt trapped in their own homes by overreaching boards. At one particularly tense meeting in a neighboring town, an elderly man stood up and said, "I've lived under my HOA for 22 years. I thought I was just supposed to obey. I didn't know I could fight back." That's when Jessica realized something else. It wasn't just about fraud or fines. It was about reclaiming a sense of freedom, of ownership, of dignity. Back in Pinewood Acres, the court-ordered audit was complete. The findings were even worse than expected. Gregory Mills had embezzled over $185,000 through his fake landscaping company and had used HOA funds for personal expenses, including vacations, electronics, and even payments on a second home outside the county. The county district attorney announced charges: fraud, embezzlement, falsification of records, and harassment. Gregory was arrested. It sent shockwaves through every HOA board in the region. Quiet meetings suddenly became scrutinized. Homeowners started asking questions, demanding answers. Transparency, once optional, became mandatory. Jessica's neighborhood held new elections that summer. The residents voted to restructure the board entirely, limiting powers, mandating public access to all financial records, and instituting term limits. It became a model for other communities, a case study in how to take power back. Months passed, but the momentum didn't slow. Jessica published a book, part memoir, part how-to guide, Behind the Fence, Fighting Back Against HOA Abuse. It debuted modestly, but within weeks, it hit bestseller lists in the law and politics categories. She used the proceeds to fund free legal aid for HOA abuse victims. But for Jessica, it always came back to the flowers. She returned to her front yard one bright morning, kneeling in the soil with her gardening gloves on. The bed was fuller now: daisies, tulips, sunflowers, and even a few experimental orchids. It was chaotic, bright, wild. Nothing like the sterile uniformity the HOA once demanded. And it was perfect. She looked around the neighborhood. Lawns no longer looked identical. Flags fluttered freely. Kids played on sidewalks. People smiled and waved. The HOA was still there, but it was different now. Accountable, neighbor-led, fair. Jessica stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. The sun was rising higher, the warmth creeping across the street. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from a homeowner in another state, asking for help starting a reform group. She smiled, because she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.